Hello, I'm Andreas Vossler. I'm a member of the course team, and in this audio I will be speaking to Sedlak, a psychoanalyst, about Freud's basic ideas. Vic trained as a clinical psychologist and as a psychotherapist at the Tavistock Clinic. He is currently a senior training analyst at the British Psychoanalytical Society. I started the interview by asking Vic what he thought Freud's greatest discoveries were.
The first one I'd start with sounds like a general one, but I think it is absolutely crucial. And it was one of the things which made him, I think, a true genius. The thing is the discovery of the dynamic unconscious. It's very specific. I think we all accept, whether we're analysts or not, that most of the time we're not conscious of so many things in our lives. I mean, at the moment you won't be conscious probably of what you had for breakfast. But if I ask you what you had for breakfast, you'll be able to remember it. So it's unconscious, but it can be made conscious. Now, what Freud was very interested was a different sort of thing, which is things that influence our behaviour and the way we feel about ourselves, the way we are in relationships, the problems we have, and we can't say why we sometimes feel unhappy, or we can't say why sometimes we're very angry with our spouses or whatever. These things are unconscious, and they're kept from consciousness dynamically. So Freud's implicit in this is Freud's concept of repression. That is, that there are things in our minds influencing our behaviour, but they're repressed. They're actually kept down by a psychological force, something that is striving to be expressed but is being kept down. And Freud also thought that that was his greatest discovery, because he famously said that three people have really disturbed the world and man. The first person was Copernicus, who said, actually, we're not the centre of the universe. Earth is just one of the planets, and we are not absolutely central. A couple of hundred years later, along comes Darwin and says, we're not separate from the animals, we've evolved. And again, that absolutely shakes the narcissism of humankind. And then along comes Freud, and he says, we thought we knew what was going on in our own minds, but actually we don't. The things that determine our behaviour very often aren't conscious. And then he goes on, and I am going to try to discover what these forces that influence us are. Now, I think that is, a marvellous discovery. And then he believes that becoming aware of these things that we try to be unconscious of, that is helpful to us. And his early work in Vienna in the late 1880, 1890, he's seeing these people who maybe, for example, have a hysterical paralysis of the arm. And he begins to try to make them aware of the thing that they're repressing. So, for example, he will think that what they're repressing is their wish to hit somebody. Hence, their arm becomes paralysed. And his theory is, if I can make them aware that they've got this urge to hit somebody, and particularly if I can find it in their history that there might have been a time when they wanted to hit their mother and got terribly anxious about this. Now, they won't remember this, but if I can remind them of it and convince them of this, then this will cure them. So I suppose the basic thing is, look, if you know yourself and accept the fact that sometimes you're angry and wanted to hit your mother and now, wants to hit someone else, if you can work through this, as the expression Freud uses, then you won't have to have a paralysis of the arm. So knowledge about yourself frees you. That's his theory. So the physician's job, or the analyst's job, is to inform the other person the stuff they're unconscious of. And this works for a while, I think partly because he's got such a sort of therapeutic zeal about it, but then he comes up against problems.
Thinking about this big discovery you just described,
yes,
I was just wondering, how did this impact or influence how Freud did see the relationship between client and therapist?
Well, at first, His model was that the therapist is, he was very keen on walking in the mountains, was Freud. And that's the metaphor or the simile he uses. He says that the therapist is like a mountain guide, and he shows people the path and he shows them the sights, and he looks after their welfare. So the therapist will create a setting in which the patient-client feels safe, and then he will instruct them about the things that he thinks are going on in their mind. You know, look, there's the Matterhorn, look, you used to be angry at your mother. And that was Freud's idea, and as I said, it worked for a while, but then he discovered there was a big problem, which is that he wanted to feel himself to be a mountain guide, you know, helping in a very kind of concerned way his patients, but he found that his patients weren't going along with this, and the patients might refuse to talk to him, or they might refuse to pay his bill, or they might not turn up for sessions.
Would that be the idea of resistance?
There are two ideas there. You're absolutely right. Resistance is one. But the other idea, because Freud faltered at that point and thought perhaps making people aware of things isn't right because they seem to be forming a different relationship with me where they don't want to be informed about what I'm saying to them. And I think lesser people might have faltered there, but Freud realised that he was trying to get people to remember things, but actually what they were doing was repeating things. And so he wrote this very famous paper, Remembering, Repeating and Working Through. So rather than the patient coming along and saying, yes, Dr. Freud, I was angry at my mother, the patient comes along and is angry at Dr. Freud and becomes a very difficult patient. And Freud's, another stroke of genius, I think, was that he realised that this actual relationship, this difficult relationship, or the patient might fall in love with Dr. Freud, which was, you know, happened, and that was also difficult. And again, Breuer, his colleague, gave up when the first psychoanalytic patient, Anna O, fell in love with Dr. Breuer, and Breuer panicked. Freud says, I was modest enough to realise that the patient's love wasn't because I'm such a wonderful human being. It was their way of expressing their relationships. And so Freud began to realise that if he could draw the patient's attention to the sort of relationship that the patient was forming with him, this was a source of insight. This was the way now of getting the patient to know thyself. You know, we're always trying to get patients to become aware of themselves and of their feelings. And Freud discovered, the best way to do this is in the here and now, as we call it. You know, the relationship that the patient forms with the therapist. That's the best way of discovering it. And the most convincing way for the patient, because it's right in front of them, you know.
And I guess the process you just described, that was named by Freud transference, or
yes.
Transferring what the client did, when the client did treat the therapist in a certain way, which just repeated the experiences.
That's right.
From the past.
Yes, that's the transference.
Mm-hmm.
And now, I mean, Freud for a long time thought that dreams were the royal road to the unconscious. But now I think we feel the transference is. And if you look at some of Freud's work, I don't think, although he wrote beautiful papers about the importance of the transference, he didn't attach it the same importance as we do now. But he discovered it, you know, and it was at a point where he really got to a low ebb. Because, you know, he was a young man, or he was in his 30s. He was desperately keen to marry. He didn't know whether he was going to make a go of this medical, psychological practice. He thought he discovered this good idea about the dynamic unconscious. Then things start going wrong. And he nearly gave up. But, you know, he kind of worked through it himself and thought, no, this is a new road I can go down. I think it's an extraordinary achievement. And of course, transference doesn't just happen in therapy. It happens in our everyday lives. If we tend to have good relationships, we meet somebody new, we're likely to have a good relationship with them because we're transferring our inner world. That's another very important thing, actually, that we all go around with various models of the world, models of how we relate to people, models of what we expect from people. And this is, we call it the inner world, but you could call it constructs, or you could call it cognitive schemata, but psychoanalysts called it the inner world. And this is how we relate to people, through this kind of prism of what we expect.
In working with his clients and working with transference, what kind of hidden and covered things did Freud discover together with the clients?
That's very important. And you're indicating another great discovery of Freud's. Now, it's not that he discovered it, but he discovered the importance of what he called instincts. We might call them urges. They're more refined, we might call them feelings. And his theory was, and this is very important for psychoanalysis still, that we develop feelings and our ways of dealing with them because when we're born into the world, we're full of instinct. I mean, our first instinct is, I've got to eat. Or I've got to breathe, actually, is the very first one. Then I've got to eat. And then I'm not being fed, I hate it. I'm putting sophisticated words to it, but if you look at the baby infant, you can see these things actually, they're making sucking noises, they want to find something to latch onto, or if they're frustrated, they'll scream. And so these instincts of wanting things and of rage at not getting them, he thought they were there from the very beginning of life, and that they slowly developed. And I mean, initially, in the three essays on sexuality, he made rather crude distinctions between the oral phase, the anal phase, and then the genital phase. And I think a lot of importance of Freud gets lost, because I think it is easy to parody that. But really what he was saying was the early stage, the oral stage, what the infant is interested in is getting things into his mouth, or her mouth. And it's making a relationship with the object of the person, the mother. Initially, first of all, probably just the breast. The infant won't have a concept of mother, but he knows there's this thing which, if he can get it into his mouth, satisfies him. So Freud really was saying, this is an oral stage, but he was also describing the relationship that pertains in the oral stage. Then the anal stage, he says that at about 6 months, the child becomes aware that it can either defecate or it can hold its stool in its rectum for a while. And he attaches great importance to this, not because he really believes that that very fact as a physiological fact is important, but it's because the child is experimenting with things. How do I hold on to things? How do I let things go? Can I keep things under my control? And the most important thing to me, my mother's presence, isn't under my control. So I've got to get used to letting things go even when I want to hang on to them. I think that's often lost. Freud really, it's not just instincts, but it's the relationships around the instincts. Mm-hmm. So,
what were his ideas then in listening to you and hearing about these different stages in childhood? But what were Freud's ideas then how these experiences in childhood kind of lead to problems and difficulties in adulthood? How did he see the relationship between these experiences in childhood and later on?
I think this is where Freud really is a man of his time, I think to his detriment. I mean, this was Vienna, 100, 120 years ago, where the role of women was really not that, it wasn't seen to be important. I mean, Freud's wife was always a housewife who kept the professor, fed and watered and kind of looked after him. So I think there is a consequence of this in Freud's theory, which is that he attaches great importance to the father and too little to the mother. But even so, he points us to the fact that the way parents treat children is terribly important, and the way parents treat their children's instincts. So, to relate it to mother, say the mother breaks off a feed too early and the infant screams. Now you can have a mother that says, "Oh, bloody hell, Johnny, will you give me some peace?" Now that will leave in Johnny's mind the idea that his needs are a real nuisance and are hated. There could be a different mother who says, "Johnny, I know this is hard, but I've just got to answer the phone. Come on, just hold on a minute." And then comes back to him and says, "I know that was horrible for you." I mean, I'm making this up, how a mother deals with it. But there's some mothers that will deal sympathetically. So it isn't only the strength of the instinct which is important according to Freud, it's also the way the environment deals with it. That's terribly important. So to answer your questions, there's the force of the instincts. So some babies are just angry. They only need a little disturbance and they scream and scream and scream. Others are much more tolerant. So it's the strength of the instincts that's important for later development, but it's also the way the caretakers take care of the infant. Now, if things go wrong, let's go back to little Johnny, whose mother was really fed up when he screamed. Now, when he becomes an adult, if things aren't changed, if that is mother's basic character, and he forms a relationship, and his girlfriend has to go away on holiday. Now, I think Johnny, that sort of Johnny, is much more likely to feel that his girlfriend is doing something cruel and nasty to him, and is likely to do something cruel and nasty back to her. The other Johnny, who was mothered better, or perhaps whose instincts weren't so strong, is more likely to think, well, I'm going to miss my girlfriend. He's going to think that a good girlfriend is leaving him and he has to pine for her. Whereas the person who either can't tolerate his instincts or whose mother couldn't tolerate his instincts is more likely to think, bloody girlfriend, And so these early things and how one handles one's emotions, how powerful they are and how other people handle them, I think are terribly important. They form the basis of our personality. I think that's Freud's, great idea that this is developmental.
You talked about the unconscious ideas and thoughts and content in general. And I was wondering, what were Freud's ideas, how people normally deal with these different forces in their inner experience?
Well, Freud thought that what causes problems is when people have to repress them. So if you're angry and you try to repress it, Freud thought that this can damage your personality. So, for example, it'll come out in an unconscious way. So you may be angry, at your wife. You repress it, you don't consciously know about it, but lo and behold, you then go and lose her check card just before she's due to go away somewhere. So it's you express it unconsciously in that way. Or another example would be that, again, you're very anxious about your anger, and so you become very inhibited, and you become very obsessive, and you feel, I must check that the gas taps have been turned off, I must check this, I must check that, and you're always worried that something is going to get out of control. Now, you don't know it's your anger, but Freud's theory was that, it's something inside you. And so, until about 1914, 1920, in that period, until 1914, his major clinical theory was that if you can make people conscious of the stuff that they're repressing, that will help them. But again, he came up against another problem. So he had to revise his theory.
So what was that problem?
The problem was that he could tell people that they were angry, and he could kind of indicate that this was an ordinary thing that, people could talk about, but the patient continued to resist it. And he realised that the major stumbling block wasn't just that people had these instincts, but that they had another part of their mind which was saying, you shouldn't feel like that. So a very judgmental part of the mind. And from 1914 onwards, he began to realise that this was something that was tremendously detrimental to human happiness. And he came to call it the superego. And he discovered it in various ways. He thought it was something terribly destructive. And of course, 1914 to 1918, he was witness. His sons were in the greatest war that there'd ever been. So he realised that actually man isn't just, women aren't just pleasure-seeking. There's something incredibly destructive in them. But he also realised he came across a number of patients who, after he had helped them on the path to what he thought was happiness, they then had very severe breakdowns. And he observed what he called the negative therapeutic reaction, where he works with patients, the therapy seems to be going well, and suddenly they get a lot worse.
What was his explanation for this?
His explanation was that there was something in their minds which said, you should not get better. And he realised that this was something very judgmental and very guilt-provoking. And that as well as being pleasure-seeking, we all have a part of our minds that says, no, you shouldn't do that. That is wicked or evil or selfish. I mean, selfish is a good example. You know, I think we all need to be selfish at times. But there are some people who, if you suggest that they're selfish, consider it a terrible insult. Whereas, you know, of course they are at times. But if you've got a superego, something that's always criticising you, and we now know that depressed people really suffer from this. You know, it's one of the things that depresses them. They're always being told they're bad, or they've done something wrong, or they should have done better. So, and Freud began to realise that as well as giving people insight into what they wanted, he also had to give them insight into just how self-critical they could be and how they expected him to be critical. So even if he wasn't being critical, they still experienced him as critical. So there was this new kind of revelation that a very powerful force in the mind is this superego, this critical agency, as he called it. And he thought that insight into that could really help.
Having all this insight and having all this knowledge, how does that then actually help people? Because you could say they could also read about these things in books, they could get this knowledge on other ways. But how does insight help people in their life?
Yes, that is a good question, because you meet a lot of people who seem to be very insightful, but you know, very often about other people and not themselves. I mean, to give you an example, let's imagine there's a university department and there are 3 colleagues there, okay? There's Mr. Green, or Dr. Green we'll call him, who's very envious. And then there's Dr. Bright, a young woman, who's very bright. And then there's their colleague, say Mr. Clever, and he's written a really, really good book that everyone agrees is a good book. Now, let's look at what happens if you don't have insight. Dr. Green is an envious man, and he says Clever's book is a load of nonsense, and Clever is absolutely stupid. Now, he's envious. But let's contrast this with Dr. Bright, the bright young woman, who says, I think Dr. Clever has written something really, really good, and I wish I'd written it. I'm envious of him. Now, I think she's got insight. She knows she's envious, and it doesn't have to be expressed in the unconscious way. I mean, Dr. Green doesn't even know he's envious. He obviously is. Everyone can see he's envious, but he doesn't know it. And how radically this Dr. Bright's insight and knowledge about herself, she does know herself, she knows she's envious, she owns her envy. And how radically that changes. She has a much better relationship with Dr. Clever. And then let's say she writes a book. Say she and Dr. Green both write books. Now, I would suspect Dr. Green will be very, very anxious about what sort of reception his book's going to get, because he's not conscious of envy. He's projected it everywhere else, and he'll think all my colleagues, particularly Dr. Clever, are really going to... So he lives in a paranoid world because he doesn't have insight into his envy. Whereas Dr. Bright, when she writes her book, she's more likely to think it's going to get a good reception. Now, I've made that up, but I just wanted to illustrate that if we do know ourselves, I mean genuinely, deeply know ourselves, and a painful process, to realise that one is envious is not an easy thing to live with. Psychoanalysis, I think, is a painful business. People really have to realise that they also hate the people they love, that they've hurt people that they love, that they've been glad when their rivals have stumbled. You have to discover something difficult about yourself and ultimately accept it. But I think it makes you a much more rounded person and much more emotionally resilient. So I think deep insight gives you emotional resilience.
Thank you very much for this. That was very interesting and insightful.